Megadeth has just released their final album, and I think this marks the beginning of the decline of heavy metal. I'll explain what I mean by that on episode 255 of Heavy Metal Philosophy. Welcome, metalheads. I'm the host of Heavy Metal Philosophy, Jon Barbas. Make sure you stick around to the end of the episode for this week's riff of the week. Now, when I say the decline of heavy metal, I obviously don't mean that metal music will stop existing. Longtime subscribers have heard me say time and time again that we are living in the best time for metal, and we're in the middle of a death metal renaissance. I recently did an episode responding to Rick Beato asking if metal is dead. No. Metal is in a good place. No, when I talk about the decline of heavy metal, I mean specifically heavy metal, not the colloquial broad umbrella of heavy metal, but the technical definition, the subgenre heavy metal. It's about to become a niche subgenre. It's about to become the underground art form that it always claimed to be. Because up until now, heavy metal has never actually been an underground genre. I'll come back to that in a minute and explain what I mean, but before I go off on that point, I should probably support some of my claims from my first and original point. I'll start by asking a question, and then I'll set some definitions. Question: Megadeth is going to tour on this final album, and when they play their final show before going into retirement, who will be the remaining active heavy metal bands? Now, before I answer that question, I should probably define what I mean by heavy metal, because I know at this point, some of you are probably thinking, Megadeth is a thrash metal band? Yes, that is correct. Now I'm going to take some liberties and go back to speaking colloquially. Bear with me for a moment. In this sense, I mean the heavy metal approach to music. I mean soaring compositions, thick harmonies, and old school, traditional, clean singing. I mean using the other four strings on the guitar besides the lowest two. Modern metal is all about the chugs. And when I say modern metal, I don't mean the technical term for the subgenre of today's metalcore. I mean modern metal, again, colloquially. I mean death metal, sludge metal, even today's crossover thrash is more focused on chugs. And I'm not complaining about that. I'm just making an honest observation where the old school approach to heavy metal, the traditional approach that I'm speaking about, was something like this. But today's metal is more like this. Now again, I want to reiterate, I'm not mad about that. I'm not complaining. I'm just observing the facts and putting out the definition so that I can make my point. So now that everything's been defined, let me return to my question. Who will be the remaining active heavy metal bands after Megadeth's final show? Last year, Ozzy Osbourne died a scant few weeks after Black Sabbath's final show. 2026 will be the first year ever in metal history without Ozzy Osbourne or Black Sabbath. And also last year, Nico McBrain retired from Iron Maiden, which begs the question, how much longer will the remaining members of Iron Maiden be able to keep going? In 2024, Judas Priest released their latest album, which proved that they still got it. But even with that, I still got to ask, how much longer can Judas Priest keep going? How much longer can Metallica keep going? When Megadeth retires, 50% of the big four will be gone. We are about to enter into a new era of heavy metal. For the next generation of kids getting into heavy metal, it's going to be a lot like me when I first got into rock music. When Baby Barbas first got into rock music, all of his favorite artists were long dead and gone. It was impossible for Baby Barbas to go to a Doors or Jimi Hendrix concert. And that's where we're very close to being with heavy metal. So if they're coming anywhere near you, if you got any remote chance to see any of these legendary and pioneering acts, do it. One of the big regrets of my life is that I didn't go to see Black Sabbath in the early 2000s when they reunited their original members and did shows. Teenage Barbas just thought he was too broke. But now in hindsight, I wish I would have picked up a couple of extra shifts or been sober for a few months. And I don't mean that how it sounds. I spent most of last year sober, and I didn't quit drinking for stereotypical alcoholic reasons. I just wanted to lose some of the belly fat that I had accumulated on my last bulking phase in the gym, because I'd rather give up beer than tacos. I'd only planned to quit drinking for a couple of months to lose 5 or 6 pounds, but then when I realized how much money I was saving, I just kept not drinking for most of the year. And I wish I would have done that for Black Sabbath, especially back then before ticket prices became what they are now. Anyway, back on topic. Now there are other bands. Just last year, Testament proved that they absolutely still got it. But now we're going down a tier in terms of popularity. And I don't mean that to throw shade at Testament. In fact, I like Testament a lot more than I like most of the big four. I'm just saying the factual statement that Testament doesn't sell as many tickets as Iron Maiden or Metallica or Megadeth does. And I also realized that right about now, a lot of you are thinking, well, John, what about all the contemporary bands playing heavy metal? Well, when I frame it in terms of high levels of popularity, I can only think of two, quote, younger bands that still take that heavy metal approach, and that's Trivium and Killswitch Engage. They still play harmonies. They still use the higher 4 strings. But there are tons of new bands that are less popular that still play that good old school heavy metal, like Hellripper. Hellripper rules. But Hellripper is an underground band, and that brings me to my point about the previous generations of heavy metal being mainstream. What was the first heavy metal band? It was Black Sabbath. And who were the proto-metal bands before them? Bands like Deep Purple and Blue Oyster Cult. And who were the heavy metal bands that followed Black Sabbath? Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. And after those titanic bands came thrash, which admittedly started as an underground scene, but then produced the biggest metal band in the world and several of its most important contributors like Slayer and Megadeth. Meanwhile, concurrently, hair metal was the darling of MTV. And that's what I mean when I say that heavy metal was never underground. Its origins were quite mainstream. All of the standard bearers of those genres are some of the biggest acts in rock history. Hence the stereotypes that we got in pop culture during the 70s and 80s of metalheads, like one of my favorites, Bill and Ted.
Put them in the Iron Maiden.
Iron Maiden? Excellent!
Execute them.
Bogus.
But what happens when these titanic figures retire and then eventually join Ozzy in immortality? Well, heavy metal will still exist, but those bands like Hellripper and Midnight and Wraith and Bewitcher, will they ever reach the soaring heights of popularity that those pioneering bands did? I seriously doubt it, which means for the first time in its history, the subgenre of heavy metal will be a wholly underground art form, which, I gotta be honest, kind of excites me, because which heavy metal experience do you prefer? Do you prefer to go to the big arenas, or do you like going to dimly lit clubs and paying less for a ticket than you did for your drunken Taco Bell order? And while Judas Priest and Testament have been the exception to the rule, where has all the exciting new heavy metal been coming from? The underground. So while I'm feeling some kind of way about all my heroes dying and retiring, I think that this generational shift is good for metal as a whole. We owe an immeasurable debt to Ozzy and Black Sabbath, and in that pantheon, I would also include Dave Mustaine and Megadeth, because in their own ways, they both defined and changed heavy metal forever. Both Ozzy and Dave were absolute kingmakers for lead guitar players. But now it's time for Dave to take his rightful place in heavy metal history. And it's time for the next generation to carry the torch, but also to light some shit on fire with it. Bands like Horrendous and Based are incorporating traditional heavy metal into death metal, and bands like Uada are incorporating it into black metal. Long live heavy metal. Now, I do have to make room for one pretty significant exception. Power metal is still traditionally heavy metal, and a lot of the younger bands in that scene are huge. Now, I still think that some of the OG pioneers like Blind Guardian and Halloween still take up most of the oxygen in the room, but there are notable exceptions like Unleash the Archers. The problem for me is I don't like power metal, but that's a me problem. And as a lover of metal in general, even though I don't like it, I'm glad it exists and is still carrying the flame. But let me say one last thing about Megadeth. I owe y'all a book recommendation for January, and since this episode is about the final Megadeth album, I want to revisit Mustaine, a heavy metal memoir by Dave Mustaine. And this book is really interesting in hindsight because it was published in 2011, shortly after Dave Mustaine and David Ellefson made up and rejoined each other in Megadeth. It's kind of interesting reading this again, considering that they've broken up again. That section reads a lot different in 2026. If you want to check out this book, there is an affiliate link in the description. Here comes the riff of the week, but most importantly, read philosophy, listen to metal. I love you.
And let there be shred.